Hello and welcome to another video in the series Chess Guide to Win. In this video I'm going to go over a specific tactic, and that tactic is the skewer. The skewer is a very similar tactic to the pin, with the slight change that generally with a pin you're going to be directly attacking one piece and sort of indirectly attacking a piece behind it that is very valuable or unprotected potentially. But the difference is with a skewer, what you generally do is you attack a very powerful piece or valuable piece, and you indirectly attack a piece behind it that isn't really as valuable, or something like that. And generally what happens when you pin one of your opponent's pieces is that piece is going to be sort of locked onto the square that it's originally on, or it's going to just be very bad if they decide to move that pin piece. Whereas with a skewer, what tends to happen is the opponent is going to move the piece that you are directly attacking, for instance a king or a queen or a rook, and that's going to leave the piece behind it open to attack. So in this specific example, and again, the pieces that you can skewer with are going to be the same pieces that you can pin with. You can do skewers with rooks, bishops, and queens, but you cannot skewer with a pawn, a king, or a knight, just based on the way they attack. So in this specific example, white is going to have access to a pretty good skewer, moving his bishop from f3 to e2. You notice that he is directly threatening the queen on black's queen on b5, but he's also indirectly threatening the rook on a6. And again, from that original position, and just in general, you should, looking at this position, understand that the queen and the rook are lined up on the same light square diagonal, which sort of sets them up to be skewered by the light squared bishop. So again, from black's perspective, should probably try to avoid situations like that. Now, also, you should note that black has no move to block the bishop's path to the queen. For example, he doesn't have like a pawn right here. He can't do that. So his pawn is too far away to sort of block this attack. So really, black's options boil down to moving the queen somewhere. There aren't really any good counterattacking possibilities. As far as with the queen, taking this pawn would be bad, taking this bishop would be bad, taking this pawn. There's one sort of subtle potential counterattack, moving this bishop to this square, but that's not really that's really a blunder. It's not really going to save black, because white has a number of different ways to respond to this that are going to be that are going to be good moves. One example is he could just push this f pawn to f3, and now black's going to have to either move his bishop or do something else. But he's whatever he does, he stands to lose material. Namely the queen here. If he captures this pawn, white can just capture back, and the skewer still stands in that continuation. Black can move his bishop back to the original square, and now black's going to lose his queen. White could even just go ahead and capture black's queen, and then if black recaptures with his bishop, white can take the rook on a6. And now, black has the option of recapturing with a pawn or moving his bishop. But either way, he's going to be down in material. He's going to be down a rook. So, that's going to be pretty bad spot for black. So again, pretty much what black might try to do is just go here with his queen. If the skewer happened, and then white can trade his bishop for a rook, and you have this situation. So And generally, if you get a chance to sacrifice or to trade a bishop for a rook, that's a lot of times that's going to be to your advantage. Based on the point system, frequently the rook is going to be worth two points more than the bishop, 5 points as compared to 3. And again, that's not always the case. You might have better moves than just trading off your bishop for a rook, or a knight for a rook. But a lot of times, having a rook instead of a bishop is going to be an advantage in the later stages of the game. So white would hopefully be able to take advantage of that going forward. Now that's not necessarily always going to be the case, but you never really know. You just look at the moves on an individual basis a lot of times, especially in the early game. You could try to analyze this very far into the later stages from this position, and it might be such that it's only a very tiny sort of advantage, but for white. But again, I do think it is pretty clearly at least somewhat of a material advantage for him to take that rook with his bishop. So we're going to go through another example of a skewer. This is going to be another bishop skewer, and once again, it's going to be attacking a queen and a rook. And this is more towards the end game. But you notice, once again, the rook and the queen are lined up on a light squared diagonal. White has a light squared bishop. Now, white does have a substantial material advantage already. So, he doesn't actually really need this skewer to win the game, probably. But it's one thing players will tend to do a lot of times, and that can be effective, is if you have a substantial material advantage, sometimes what's going to be good for you to do is just trade off pieces. Now you don't want to trade pieces, you don't want to trade your valuable pieces for their, like pawns and stuff. But if you can trade like a bishop for a knight, or a bishop for a bishop, a rook for a rook, a queen for a queen, a lot of times, depending on the position, a lot of times that can give the player with a material advantage. It can help them get to a very easy end game to win. And one of the reasons for that is if you get to an end game where, it's just pawns and kings, but one side has like 1 or 2 extra pawns, maybe they have a pawn that's really far advanced on the board. The fewer pieces on the table to sort of contest that extra pawn or that, far advanced pawn, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to promote that pawn and potentially get an advantage and win the game. Whereas from this position, black's still got some sort of counter-attacking possibilities with a rook and his queen. He can always threaten, something like, maybe if he gets to a situation like this, he can threaten checkmate, even though he's down like a bishop and, a pawn. So, whereas if white starts trading off his pieces, for example, he does the skewer, moving his bishop to f3, skewers, he attacks the queen, but he's also threatening the rook on c6. So, now black looks at the board and he can't really counterattack very well. So he's probably going to move his queen somewhere, potentially here. And now white is going to have the option to just capture the rook, trade the bishop, essentially. And now we get to a situation where white is a full rook and a pawn ahead of his opponent. And now there's really no hope for black to stop this pawn or capture this pawn. So he's going to be in a lot of trouble. White can do something like this to sort of pin the queen to the king. Potentially trade it off. And if he did that, now there's no way for black to stop this pawn from queening. The lone king. These pawns can't do anything about this pawn. So anyway, that's sort of one continuation that the game could go through. But the point being here is the more pieces that white trades off, potentially the better his situation looks. Like I said, if he's able to trade queens off somehow, well, now black has no way, as long as this rook is set up on this file, he has no way to stop this pawn from becoming a queen, which is going to be game deciding. Now, again, white does have to worry about black getting his pawns down, but his pawn is much further advanced on the board towards his promotion square. So, but you know, if we just look at you know, the sort of skewer there that happened, it was a pretty easy to see skewer, um, and it led to a situation that was a lot better for white. I would say that this is, you know, it should be a pretty simple end game to win from here for white. I would say, whereas the other one, like I said, you know, that the rook and the queen, you know, gave black some sort of potential counterattacking possibilities if white made some mistakes. Not to say that white would, you know, wouldn't be able to win if he didn't do that skewer, but I just think it just makes it a little bit easier for white to win there. So we're going to go to another example, and once again, this is going to be a bishop skewering some pieces. Once again, this is an in-game situation, a little bit of a bizarre one, but black has made a big mistake here by having his queen and his king lined up on the light-colored diagonal, because white only has a light-squared bishop to attack with, and he's got this pawn sort of threatening promotion, but black's queen is sort of preventing that. So if it's white's turn to move, black is going to go from a game that should be an easy win for him to almost assured loss. You know, if white makes the correct moves, and he doesn't really have, you know, once he does this skewer, white's moves are really going to be pretty much forced. It's going to be almost impossible for him to miss the correct moves here. So once he does the skewer, so the skewer is going to be moving the e2 bishop to f3, directly attacking the king and giving check. And this is going to be a priority move. Black has no choice but to respond to the check, and the only way he can get out of check is by moving his king. So you know, he might move his king here, and white is going to simply be able to capture the queen. Black can recapture, but that's not really any consolation, because now white can simply push the pawn on h6 up towards h8. Black has no piece guarding this b2 pawn either, so he could promote his pawn, but the king is guarding b1 as well, so you know, he can promote, then white can just capture the pawn there. Or, you know, if black tries to move towards the pawn, instead of actually capturing the bishop, it still doesn't matter. The pawn is too close to, you know, it's too close to being promoted. He can't get his king back in time to stop that. Anyway, and once again, still nothing guarding this pawn on b2. So, you know, whenever white wants to capture that, he can, and he doesn't really have any urgency to capture it, because it's not really a threat as long as the king is here on c2. You know, so again, pretty much neutralizes black's threats and makes this pawn a huge threat, and essentially wins the game for white as long as he sort of makes the correct moves, promotes the pawn, you know, takes this pawn at some point, or you know, takes it when it promotes, and then you know, goes along and gets checkmate with his king and queen situation. So again, that was a pretty decisive skewer, and again, when you skewer a king and a queen together, that's going to, a lot of times, like pinning a king and a queen together, a lot of times that's going to be a massive swing in the game. Generally, you're going to, if you can skewer a king and a queen, especially with like a bishop or a rook, a lot of times that can be just a game winner. Or if you're way behind, that can sort of get you back in the game, because you know, you're going to end up trading off a bishop or a rook for a queen generally. So you know, that's going to be a huge advantage for you a lot of times. So So now we're going to look at a different sort of example. And this example is going to be a little bit more complex than the previous ones. In the previous examples, the tactics have been sort of limited to like 1 or 2 moves that you really have to look at. And now this one you might look at like 2 or 3 or 4 moves in advance. And you have to sort of account for a few different things. There's counterattacking possibilities. There's good continuations, bad continuations from both sides. So this is a little bit not quite as simple and easy to see as some of the other examples. Now this is going to be a skewer with a rook. Now on this board position, it looks like white has 1 pawn extra over his opponent, but his opponent has a bishop over white. So, arguably black has more material. Now white's pawn on g6 is very far advanced, so that's potentially a little bit of an advantage for white, having that pawn so far advanced. But otherwise, you might say that black is doing pretty well in this position. But if it's white's turn to move, that is going to make all the difference, because white is going to be able to utilize a skewer. Now there's a couple of different ways he can utilize the skewer. One is if he just goes ahead and skewers the king and the rook, moving his a5 rook to or his a1 rook to a5. He's going to directly attack the king, put him in check, and force him to move somewhere. Now let's say he moves right here. Now this allows white 2 options. His first option is to capture the rook on f5 with his a5 rook. Now I think this is probably the worst move he can do going forward from his skewer, because it gets black out of trouble, because he can simply recapture with the rook on h5, and now black has just traded, essentially white has traded a rook for a rook. So there was no real material advantage gained that way. But one of the other continuations for white would be to capture the rook on h5 with his rook on h1. So sorry, let me put this back the way it was. Okay, so this is going to be the situation if he captures the rook on h5 with his rook on h1. These rooks are still pretty much protecting each other along this rank. If black decides to capture on a5, white can recapture with his rook on h5, and sort of vice versa. If he captures the rook on h5, white can recapture with his rook. So let's say it goes down like that. Now you've got a situation where white has an extra pawn, and he has a rook versus a bishop. Now this should be a pretty simple, again, it should be a pretty simple endgame for white to win, because he can go ahead and protect this pawn with the rook, and there's not really a lot black can do about that. He doesn't really have an answer for this. As long as this pawn on b2 is on a dark square, black's bishop cannot attack it, can't really threaten it. He can't really overload this pawn with anything, because he can get his king over here to attack it. He can get his king any number of squares around this pawn to attack it, but it's protected by this rook. So this pawn on d6 can't get here to attack it. Now he can bring this pawn on c4 down to threaten it, but once this happens, white can simply take, black retakes. So that's simply trading off the pawn, and again, this isn't really white's big threat. It's really just sort of preventing black's threat of promoting his pawn on c4, since it guards the c3 square. So that's really the main the main strength of this pawn. And sort of the main weakness of this pawn on c4 is there's no way for this pawn on c4 without some help from maybe the king to get past the b2 pawn. So, and once the b2 pawn is protected by a rook, there's no way black can dislodge that without giving up his pawn as long as white's playing correctly. So that's really really the end of that story. And then white can move his pawn to or his knight to g2 and potentially threaten to promote this pawn. He can do all sorts of things, but generally this should be again pretty easy for white, a pretty strong in game for white. Shouldn't be too hard for white to get the win from here. So now if we go back to the original position, one of the reasons I said this was a complex sort of example is because it offers a lot of like opportunities for white. White has a couple of different sort of ways to go about skewering his opponent. Black threatens, black has certain threats about check with his bishop, in certain situations. Let's say the position goes this way and white captures on h5 with the rook. Well, now black can check with his bishop, and in this position white could potentially capture with his rook. He could move his king right here, and now black has certain options. He can trade rooks, or he could have just simply moved his rook potentially. Moved it somewhere else, here for example. But if he does that, then then white can capture this bishop for no compensation. So in that continuation, it was going to be bad for black as well. And in this other example, I'm going to show you sort of a combination that's going to be sort of making the skewer even stronger potentially than it might have looked in those other examples. So here, if white, instead of skewering immediately, if white lures, if he trades his rook, his h rook, with the rook on h5, then and then black recaptures. Well, now you've got the skewer is still there on a5 with the rook, and now this rook went from being on a protected square by the bishop to being on an unprotected square at h5. So now the skewer is going to be really strong because there was no real answer for it here. So now he's going to be able to just get this rook for free, and now white has a rook and 3 pawns against 2 pawns. And again, you get to this situation where this pawn on b2 is really preventing any threat from black, and white is still threatening to promote his pawn here. Now this is maybe not the very sort of best situation for white, but I would say it still looks like a pretty strong endgame for white because black is sort of limited on what he can do with this light squared bishop. He can potentially block white from queening for a bit. He can guard that square. But what's likely to happen is at some point black's going to have to trade his bishop for this pawn from this position, or just hope that white makes a giant blunder, and maybe he sets his rook right there, and then maybe he can he can do a skewer of his own and trade off his bishop for that rook. But the problem, even in that scenario, is now black has nothing stopping this pawn from queening. So, it's going to queen, and his king can't. His king has to go sort of a weird way to get to this b2 pawn. So he doesn't really have the time both to capture the b2 pawn and also to advance his pawn 3 squares to promote before white promotes his pawn. So again, really best case scenario for black is if white recognizes these skewers. Best case scenario is really sort of just a lost endgame. So, while it looked like black had sort of a material advantage, if it's white's turn to move from here, white has a number of different possibilities for skewering his opponent's pieces, and simplifying this endgame to really take the threats away from black, because once the rooks are off the table, sort of like I alluded to earlier, once you start trading off pieces, something like a far advanced pawn can become very very powerful with fewer pieces on the board. So that's something to keep in mind. So, and again, skewering to get a piece for free essentially is obviously going to be to your advantage. And I'm going to go ahead and give you one more example of a skewer since I haven't done a queen skewer. I will set the go ahead and set the board up like so, and put the pieces on the board like this. So in this situation, most people would be tempted to say that the player with the queen is winning this game, but it really depends on whose move it is here. Which side of which of these players has the better position? If it's white's turn to move, yes, white is not only has a material advantage because of the queen against the rook, but white is going to be able to skewer black's king on d7 with his queen moving to a7. And notice there's no response here that doesn't leave black's rook vulnerable to capture. So now we've got a situation where black can't win, and it should be very easy for white to win. But on the other hand, if it is black's move in this scenario, then black actually has the winning position, because he has the same potential for a skewer with his rook against the king and the queen. So white has made a huge mistake if he's gotten to this point and it's black's move, because now black can check white's king. White's only option is to move the king. No matter which square he goes to, the queen is going to be left unprotected. And now you have a king and a rook against a lone king. So that game went from a sure, or not a sure, but sort of a likely loss for white to a likely win for black. So and let me go ahead and go through some of the reasoning behind why I say it was a likely win for white, because if white's sort of making the correct moves, and this is sort of one of the reasons why obviously the queen is going to be considered stronger than the rook, is the queen has, like the bishop, the queen can move along a diagonal. And the combination of being able to move on diagonals as well as being able to move the same way that a rook can move is sort of the ways the queen can attack are much different and much more than the ways the rook can attack. So it's very easy for white to sort of to sort of get black in check. He can do it along diagonals. He can fork the king and the rook much easier than you can fork the rook and the queen. So it's not to say that you can't fork you can't use a rook to fork a king and a queen. It's just much more difficult because well, the main thing is you have to protect the rook if you're going to fork those two. If the rook forks those two pieces and is unprotected, the queen simply captures the rook. So you have to have it protected, and again, it's going to be much harder to set that up generally. Whereas, it might be a little bit easier to set up a skewer or something like that. But anyway, like I was saying, the queen has many more angles of attack that she can sort of go for, So a lot of times if you've got a queen and your opponent's got a rook and there's no other pieces on the board besides the kings, the queen player is going to be the one on the offensive, and it's much harder for the rook only player to sort of stay on the offensive simply because he can't move along diagonals. So he can put the king in check, but the king can continually move sort of along diagonals to get closer to the rook. And as soon as black doesn't give check to white, white's going to be able to he's going to be able to really start moving all over the place with the queen and getting check. And at some point he might be able to go like right here, giving check, threatening the rook, something like that. He can continually put the black king in check. And black might be able to find the right moves to get himself out of check. But in terms of winning the game, it's going to be very difficult from black's perspective to win. Now, white might find himself in a situation where he can actually just checkmate with his lone queen, which is something like this. Getting his queen here if black ends up blocked off like that. But anyway, like I said, the main thing is the different ways the queen can move compared to the rook gives the player with the queen many more opportunities, and the player with the rook has a lot more to sort of be concerned about when looking at the position. Where to put his king and his rook so they're not vulnerable to forks, they're not vulnerable to skewers, maybe they're less vulnerable to pins. So those are the things that you have to worry about. And again, hopefully in this video you will have sort of seen the general trends with skewers. It really depends on the way the pieces attack. Obviously, determines how they can skewer and what you need to be aware of. If your opponent has, for instance, a light squared bishop, obviously you want to stay off of light squared diagonals, both for pins and for skewers. If they've got a rook, you need to stay off of ranks and files. With your pieces, you don't want to set yourself up for a skewer like this. Losing your queen, and sort of the same deal goes if your opponent's got a queen. You have to watch out for both diagonals, and you have to watch out for being on the same diagonal and on the same rank and file, both for pins and skewers. So you sort of through this video you saw the different pieces that could do skewers. You saw some examples like in the early game and in the late game where they can come up. They're not always going to be sort of game winning, but they are going to generally put you in a better position a lot of times. Now again, it depends on the board situation, whether using a skewer or not is going to help you, but it's just one possibility, one possible tactic that you can have in your arsenal, both in terms of attacking and in terms of defense, that you need to be aware of. If your position is such that your opponent can skewer you or pin you or fork you, you need to be aware of that. You need to avoid those situations to avoid getting falling behind in material, or in board position. It can make certain moves can make their attack much more threatening, uh, and etc. So, and there's a few other tactics I'm going to go over in other videos that I haven't gone over so far. Uh, that can be very strong as well, and hopefully that will help you. Familiarizing yourself with all these different tactics will help you. Analyzing a board position will help you to see. Hopefully, will help you to see your better moves quicker and easier, and also it will help you to avoid your blunders because you will hopefully recognize situations or moves that will set you up for a skewer. For example, in this board situation, let's say it's Black's turn to move. Obviously moving right here isn't going to help him. You know, checking isn't going to help him. All these different things, but aren't going to help him. So he's going to have to understand what he needs to do, understand the danger of leaving these pieces on the same dark square diagonal, and the same thing for if it's White's move. He would be wise not to put his queen right here on g4 because that sets up this skewer. So obviously being aware of these things and experience, again, playing through games and seeing these things happen in games is going to help you to to understand better the tactics and how to use them, how to avoid them, when they're likely to come up, etc. So and understanding the names of the tactics, a pin, a skewer, a fork, the concept itself, it's going to help you to sort of more logically look at the game of chess and sort of figure it out. Before, if you didn't really know these concepts, these tactics that I've been going over, what a pin is, what a fork is, what a skewer is, it's not that you maybe wouldn't be able to see one of those things individually if it was there, a fork, attacking multiple pieces with a knight or something like that. It's not that you might not have it's not that you would totally be unable to see a move like that, but you might be more likely to be looking for something like that, or you might be more likely to try to set up something like that. For example, if you can sort of lure your opponent's king to a certain square that sets up for a knight fork, for example, or that sets up for a skewer or a pin, for example, that's a little bit more of a complex or subtle thing, that's going to help you get better at the game of chess, looking for things like that, seeing them quicker, seeing them more often. That these things are the ways that you sort of improve your game. Whereas, if you didn't know the names of these tactics, or you haven't seen them very often for whatever reason, you wouldn't necessarily be looking for that, both on the attack and on defense. So, out of 10 potential forking opportunities, for example, maybe you see 2 or 3, or 4 or 5, but maybe there's like a handful of them that you missed that could have won you games, or that could have helped you win games or get ties, or or something like that. So yeah, that's sort of the general idea with the tactics, with naming them, and with sort of giving you examples, with all the different pieces that can do them, and giving you examples from sort of different, either early game, mid game, or late game, to see sort of how they come up, what they look like, and to sort of help you be more familiar with them, so it's easier, hopefully, to use them and avoid getting beaten by these tactics. So So again, this is going to be the end of the video. Hopefully this was helpful for you, and if you have any questions, feel free to send me comments. Leave some comments. You know, you can send me messages individually, and I will try to, you know, answer those as they come up. And again, there will be, you know, I will be doing videos on the other tactics in the future as well. So this is going to be the end of this video, and until next time, take care.